Thank you very much indeed, Sam. That's very kind of you. And thank you also to Tewkesbury Historical Society for inviting me here this evening. I consider it a very great honour. Now, this is a dry presentation, so I hope you've all had a lot to drink. And I can tell you that if you've not already had a lot to drink, you'll need a lot to drink by the end of it. But in a more serious vein, this is a talk about the most fundamental aspect of our existence. It's about what makes us a society. It's about the norms, the rules which bind us together. It's about fairness. And that is a concept so deeply embedded within us that it is well understood by a 4-year-old. Tonight, I want to talk about how this concept of fairness was applied in the war crimes trials after the Second World War. We'll first have a look at international law, the law the Allies chose to try the defendants by, and then we'll look briefly at 3 trials and 3 defendants. The first is the Belsen trial, and I shall argue that at least one defendant, Joseph Kramer, was wrongly convicted. The second is the principal Nuremberg trial. The defendant I've chosen, Hermann Goering, was charged with crimes against humanity and waging a war of aggression, and neither charge was appropriate. And the third is the trial of General Yamashita, which took place in Manila, where the judges convicted him without evidence on a charge never before heard in a court. I want to start this talk by saying that I'm pleased to be British, that I think that the British Armed Forces, and as Sam said, I was once an officer in the Territorial Army, are amongst the finest in the world, if not the finest. And because this talk is about law and justice, I also want to say that I would far rather be tried in an English court than in any other. I think I can say these things only because we recognise that we are capable of making mistakes. Making mistakes is human. It's part of what we are. As an example, during the period from 2000 to 2014, that's more than 14 years, 732 postmasters were tried for fraud and convicted, with many being sent to prison. 4 people committed suicide. And yet, even after the offence had been proven in court many hundreds of times, people were questioning the justice of it. An investigation then proved that it was not the postmasters who were responsible for the discrepancies, but a bug in a computer program. And that is now known as the Great Post Office Scandal. In other words, we review our past, we affirm what we believe to be right, but we identify and correct our mistakes. And that's what I want you to do this evening. I want you to look at the war crimes trials after the Second World War. And I want you to examine them and to see whether you think that they were just. What do I mean by just? I mean, were the defendants tried according to accepted law? By impartial judges? In a court using procedures which were fair? And on the basis of evidence which was properly obtained? And just for clarity, a man might have murdered Mr. Smith. If he is charged with committing a different murder, say of Mr. Brown, but did not do it, and is found guilty of that murder, then that conviction is unjust. You might think perhaps that overall justice has been served, that there has been poetic justice, but that's not the way that I am using words. Poetic justice is not justice. If you wish to punish someone for murdering Mr. Smith, prove that he did in fact murder Mr. Smith. And I ask you to come to the matter with fresh eyes. In 1945, people thought, or were weaning themselves off thinking, that the only good German was a dead German. You come to this matter largely free of that bias. And I say largely because your parents or grandparents spent 6 years fighting that war and will have imparted to you in greater or lesser measure their views. Listen to what I say. Ask yourself whether it sounds reasonable. Can you deduce anything from it? Whatever you do it on your own analysis of events, on the basis of reasons which are clear in your mind, not on what you've been brought up to believe. You might end up this evening with no doubt that everything was done absolutely properly and that justice was done. Or you might take a different view. Awful things are done in war. That's the nature of war. But some of those things are permitted by law, others are not. Those that are not permitted are called war crimes. There have been war crimes for probably as long as there have been wars. You might remember one such crime being mentioned by Shakespeare in Henry V. At Agincourt, the French cavalry come behind the English front line and kill the boys who were guarding the luggage. Henry saw this as a breach of what he called the law of arms and was outraged, and as a reprisal he ordered all the French prisoners held by the English to be put to death. In more recent times, formal international agreements have been made. The Hague and Geneva Conventions are examples, and these define certain acts as war crimes. These traditional rules of warfare, together with the more recent formal agreements, are recognized internationally and form part of what is known as international law. International law is not English law, not German law or American law. It's separate and distinct from them, although of course it's very likely to be reflected in the laws of those countries. Now, let's look at our first trial, that of Joseph Kramer. The Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Belsen, was a prison camp located between Hanover and Hamburg. It was set up in accordance with the German laws of the time in exactly the same way as HMP Brixton or Wormwood Scrubs are set up today under English law. Joseph Kramer was the commandant of Belsen. He joined the German prison service in 1934, served at Auschwitz, and in December 1944 was posted to Belsen as the commandant in the rank of captain. Belsen, and this should be clearly understood, was not an extermination camp like Auschwitz. It was a prison for those who were out of favour with the German authorities, ordinary criminals, of course, but also Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, the disabled, and so on. And initially, it wasn't a bad camp. Mareike Frank Abrams, a 19-year-old Jewish woman from Hungary, was transferred to Belsen from Auschwitz in 1944. She said, "The conditions were so superior to Auschwitz, we felt we were practically in a sanatorium." But after Kramer had taken up his responsibilities, things rapidly changed. But this was largely because two new factors were at play. The Germans were being pushed westwards by the advancing Russians. As they retreated, they sent large numbers of prisoners from the concentration camps in the east to those in the west. This put great pressure on the receiving camps. And the second was that Belsen had been designated as a camp for the sick. That was not a bad idea in itself, since in theory it meant that ill people and medical staff could be brought together in an effective manner. Not surprisingly, the numbers of prisoners arriving at Belsen started to increase dramatically, to the point where the camp very rapidly became overcrowded. The new arrivals came on foot, by lorry and by rail, at all times of the day and night, and often without warning. Kramer had no right to refuse any of them. There was chaos. Now, the British and Americans had been subjecting Germany to a merciless bombing campaign. Our targets had been not only purely military targets, but also entire cities, and of course railway marshalling yards, bridges and locomotives. And these attacks had caused widespread disruption and chaos, just as we had intended. The journeys that some of the prisoners arriving at Belsen had to endure were horrific. Journeys which in peacetime would take 5 hours would take 5 days. It's been estimated that up to 30% of those being taken to Belsen were dead before they could reach the camp, and the state of the remainder can only be imagined. The British, under Lieutenant Colonel Richard Taylor, liberated the camp on the 15th of April 1945, and the conditions they found inside were appalling. Starvation was widespread. Food was in desperately short supply, and had been for some time. The military supply system had not increased its deliveries to accommodate the growing population of the camp. Kramer said that he'd tried to purchase food locally from private contractors, but he'd not been successful. A train bringing medical supplies to the camp had been bombed. The supply of electricity had failed, quite possibly because of Allied bombing raids on Hanover. And because the pumps supplying water to the camp were driven by electricity, there was no water. Sanitation was entirely absent. To make matters worse, if that were possible, typhus had been brought into the camp some weeks previously, and soon significant numbers of people were dying. In February 1945, deaths were running at 60 a day, and in March, that had risen to 250. Kramer said that he had written to his chief, General Glücks, on the 1st of March, asking for immediate assistance. The letter was ignored. And when the British arrived, the rate was 800 a day. Many of the guards at the camp ran away before the British arrived, and Kramer could have done so too. He might even have disappeared entirely. But he stayed, and he is said to have been the only commandant of a major concentration camp to do so. I suggest to you that he thought he had nothing to fear from the British. But the British were, quite rightly, appalled by what they saw. They arrested Kramer, they called in the press, who quickly gave him the moniker Beast of Belsen. They then put him on trial. He said that he had done his best for the camp. Now, we can all accept that what he had in fact done was woefully inadequate. But what should he have done? Indeed, what could he have done? A clue to that question might exist in what the British actually did. When they took over the camp, they confirmed Colonel Taylor as commandant, and to advise him on medical matters, they sent in a brigadier, Brigadier Hugh Glynn Hughes. Do we have a photograph? And the next one, please. Yes. Brigadier Hugh Glynn Hughes, who was the Deputy Director of Medical Services in the Second Army. Kramer was a captain, 2 ranks lower than Taylor, and therefore presumably less competent. And he had only 1 junior doctor on his staff, not a medical brigadier who was the Deputy Director of Medical Services of an army, and he couldn't draft in more. Colonel Taylor had under his command about 100 men, including members of a field ambulance. Supplies of all sorts were not long in arriving. Within 24 hours, he had available to him 27 water bowsers. That's what a water bowser is. And sufficient vehicles to tow them. And these were rapidly put to use, bringing water from a river. Kramer, by contrast, had 3 water bowsers, but he couldn't move them because all his vehicles had broken down. The British arranged for food to be delivered, and a reasonable meal was available on the evening of the 16th. They were helped in this because there was a Panzer troop school about 3 kilometres from the camp, and it had a good stock of food of various kinds, including 600 tons of potatoes, 120 tons of tinned meat, and 30 tons of sugar. That was not an enormous amount for the 40,000 people who Kramer thought were in the camp, but it would certainly have been welcome. But it was not issued. Kramer explained that the storeman at the Panzer School had no authority to issue it, and that he had no authority to requisition it. In an army, and especially, you might think, in the German army of 1945, orders are to be obeyed. Taylor's forces were supplemented on the 2nd of May, an important day because it was the day on which my parents married. And if that hadn't happened, he wouldn't have been coming to this lecture this evening. By the arrival of 98 medical students flown in specially from London. Later, after the war in Europe had ended, on the 8th of May, no fewer than 3,000 more troops arrived and were put to work building a 7,000-bed hospital, the largest in Europe. And this was staffed by, amongst others, scores of German doctors and nurses brought in for the purpose. That was the scale of the problem. Huge. Could the Germans have done this? Possibly. But that wasn't the question before the court. Could Kramer have done it? He was the man on trial. I suggest that he was overwhelmed by circumstances and virtually impotent to make any serious change. His counsel told the court, "When the curtain finally rings down on this stage, Joseph Kramer will, in my submission, stand forth not as the beast of Belsen, but as the scapegoat of Belsen." But perhaps, you might think, he spent his time going around the camp, and assaulting inmates. Colonel T.M. Backhouse, the prosecutor at the trials, said at a meeting of the Salient-Altrincham discussion group in February 1946, which was widely reported in the press, that Kramer was about the only one of the 43 prisoners against whom no individual act of cruelty was proved. So, what was he found guilty of? That's a good question. The British had chosen to charge him with war crimes under international law. War crimes are crimes committed against the enemy, not against your own side. If you kill 1 or 1,000 of your own citizens, this is, or was in 1944, a matter under your national law. And remember that Kramer was being tried for crimes under international law. If the British could find no evidence that he had directly ill-treated anybody, Allied or German, as Backhouse's comments suggest, they had a real problem. What should they charge him with? The answer they came up with was ingenious, if contrived. 12 Allied prisoners were believed to have died in the camp from the appalling conditions. As we've said, they could not prove that Kramer had directly caused the deaths of any of them. So they charged him with conspiring to cause their deaths through ill-treatment. Of course, the 10,000 unidentifiable corpses lying unburied, effectively the focus of the horror felt by the whole world, were largely irrelevant to this indictment, and you might wonder if this is the sign of a strong case. You might perhaps even wonder if the prosecution was grasping at straws. Now, if you and I conspire to rob a post office, we're guilty the moment we have sat down to plan who will do what. Who will carry the cosh? Who will carry the swag bag? We don't need actually to carry out a robbery. If we do in fact carry out the robbery, it's only evidence that we have conspired. And now a simple question. How do you prove a conspiracy? What evidence would you, if you had been sitting as a judge at this Belsen conspiracy trial, have expected to be put before you to support the charge of conspiracy? In our case, robbing the post office, the police might have bugged our conversation and played the tapes to the court, or shown the court letters or emails we'd exchanged. And that would be enough to put us in the slammer. But at Belsen, there were no documents, there were no plans, there were no minutes of meetings, there were no reported conversations from which it was clear that Kramer had planned and plotted with others to ill-treat their prisoners. So what was the evidence? Well, there was evidence of guards mistreating prisoners, murdering them even. And the prosecution claimed that this showed that there was a conspiracy, that the guards were acting together in a concerted manner as a group. The defense pointed out that the camp was in a state of chaos. If there was chaos, there was not organization. And if there was no organization, there could have been no conspiracy. The judges had to decide. If they chose one interpretation, then they could hang Kramer. If they chose another, then he was not guilty of conspiracy and would walk free, together with all his 42 co-defendants. They had no difficulty. They will have been aware, of course, that at home the public were baying for blood, that the reputation of Great Britain, and indeed of its empire, lay in their hands. And on a more personal note, they would have been aware that as army officers, their futures in the army were still to be decided. But of course, whether any of this had any impact on their deliberations, we do not know. But what they did conclude was that there had been a conspiracy and that the conspirators should be punished. And they sentenced Joseph Kramer to death. Let me tell you what 3 people thought about this. First, the view of a co-defendant at the trial, Lisowitz. The evidence against her was an allegation contained in a sworn written statement made by an accuser who was not present in court and who could not therefore be questioned, that she had struck and thereby killed 2 prisoners. No proof was offered to the court that the prisoners were allies or even that the prisoners had died. Lisowitz strenuously denied the charge. Nevertheless, she was found guilty, that is, guilty of being party to a conspiracy to ill-treat Allied prisoners. She described the proceedings as a farce. And now, a British MP, Vernon Bartlett, the member for Bridgewater. He'd expected to see many, or even most, of the defendants found guilty and hanged, and was surprised when this turned out not to be the case. His view of the whole thing was that it was a farce. And the third view is that of an independent, and I submit respected, commentator, The Economist newspaper. They said, trials on the basis of British justice look like farces. But you must form your own view. Now let's turn to Hermann Goering. The Allies had won the war in Europe, and they were angry. They were angry that they had endured so much suffering, and they were angry that their enemies had acted with such callous brutality to the people whom they had conquered. And they thought that something had to be done. Goering was one of Hitler's earliest supporters and rose to command the Luftwaffe. After the war, he was arrested, and the Allies decided to put him on trial. Just before we turn to that, if I could just ask you about the High Street in Tewkesbury. It's currently got a 30-mile-an-hour limit on it, and I think that's wrong and probably dangerous. I know that many towns, Bristol and London, for example, have 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. Would anybody here be willing to join me in a campaign to have that speed limit reduced to 20 miles an hour? If you would you put your hands up? Thank you. Okay, that's good. Thank you. Back to Nuremberg. Sorry, the Allies met in London, and on the 15th of August 1945, at what is known as the London Conference, they issued a declaration that they would establish an international military tribunal at Nuremberg to try major war criminals, with 8 eminent lawyers acting as both judge and jury. What they wanted to do was to show to the world that the German Reich had murdered millions of innocent people in the course of an evil and unnecessary war. And I now concentrate on 2 areas, which are called crimes against humanity and crimes against peace. The murder of 6 million Jews was high in the minds of the prosecutors. But, as we have seen with the Belsen trial, there was no international treaty which prevented a state from murdering as many of its citizens as it wished. The deaths of these Jews, or very many of them, were therefore of no judicial importance. That was not acceptable to the Americans. They wanted to make it illegal in international law, for a state to murder its own people. And so, with the support from Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, they decided to charge Hermann Goering with an offence which they called crimes against humanity. And this they defined as murder, extermination, enslavement, or deportation of any civilian population. This includes what was for the first time called genocide. In his opening statement, Robert Jackson, the American prosecutor, said that the conquering Allies would submit their enemy captives to the judgment of the law. However, as you will now understand, if at any date before the 15th of August 1945 you had searched all the legal textbooks in the world for this law on the extermination or enslavement of any civilian population, or the law on initiating a war of aggression, which we'll come to in a moment, you wouldn't have found it. And so Jackson was forced to give an explanation. We propose, he said, to punish acts which have been regarded as criminal since the time of Cain and have so been written in every civilized code. Now, what does that mean? Jackson was proposing that civilized people would dictate how non-civilized people lived and would regulate their lives. That sounds very reasonable, but only, I suggest, if you are a civilized person. Who then are these civilized people? Mr. Jackson was one, presumably. I've no doubt that every member of the Tewkesbury Historical Society here tonight would also be included. But the Germans, whose homeland gave birth to Schiller and Goethe, Beethoven and Mozart, and Albert Einstein, were clearly not. And so it was, this charge, unknown before the 15th of August 1945, and indeed defined only after the commission of the acts to which it referred, was put to Goering and 19 other defendants standing in the dock at Nuremberg, in proceedings which Jackson himself described as novel and experimental. 16 were found guilty on this count, and of those, 12, including Goering, were sentenced to death. And let's turn to another of those charges, that of committing crimes against peace, that is, being engaged in the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of war of aggression. The Allies claimed that Goering and 15 other German leaders were guilty of this offence, one which again they proposed to punish with either imprisonment or death. Waging a war of aggression, indeed waging a war of any sort, aggressive or defensive, had not been considered illegal before August 1945. A war might have been unjust, or immoral, or injudicious, but it was never illegal, never against the law, simply because there was no law. England, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany had created empires by waging wars against various peoples and conquering them, and they did so legally. In 1846, President Polk of the United States decided that his country should fulfill what he called its manifest destiny of occupying a territory which stretched, as he said, from sea to shining sea. And he brought about this destiny by entering into a war with Mexico and seizing from Mexico the land which is now called California and New Mexico. No one suggested that he acted illegally. Indeed, the whole of the First World War, which caused the deaths of over 60 million people, was fought with no charge of waging a war of aggression being raised against any participating individual or state. But in August 1945, the victorious Allies took a different view. From then on, or rather from 6 years previously, from the 3rd of September 1939, planning or waging what they called a war of aggression would be illegal and would be punishable by death. How wise, how enlightened, you might think. But what is a war of aggression, you ask? Unfortunately, the Allies didn't provide a definition, and so I can't help you. What I can do is offer you two examples. The first is the war which we declared on Germany in 1939, and the second is the war which we declared on Japan in 1941. I know that because 12 Germans were found guilty of this offence by the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal, and 7 of them were hanged. And 6 Japanese were executed for the same offence. More than that, I cannot say. But you might think, perhaps this new law is a good one. Has it, perchance, had a benign, positive influence on the world and changed it for the better? In 2003, Tony Blair, supported by 60% of MPs and 54% of the British public, took us to war with Iraq, 3,000 miles away. He said that he was defending us from the threat of attack by weapons of mass destruction, deployable at 45 minutes. A defensive war. Now, I don't imagine the Iraqis would accept this claim for 1 minute. They would have seen British tanks rolling across their borders and machine gunning their soldiers and would have considered it a highly aggressive war. And in support of that view, they would have pointed out that they had never threatened the UK and did not have weapons of mass destruction. The United States attacked Cuba in 1959, Grenada 1983, and Panama in 1989. It's very difficult to believe that any of these countries posed a threat to their large neighbour. Indeed, it's far easier to believe that the United States merely wished to establish in these countries governments which were sympathetic to American interests. But if that's what we mean by defensive, then every war ever conducted was defensive. There's no time to mention America's long war in Vietnam, or the American bombing of Cambodia, or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or the subsequent invasion of that benighted country by the British and the Americans, or the American invasion of El Salvador, or the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, or indeed any of a dozen other invasions of independent states by a large neighbour, which have occurred since wars of aggression were outlawed. But what I should say is that since the Second World War, no one has been found guilty of this crime. Indeed, no one has even been prosecuted for it. It's as though the law had been created solely for the purposes of trying and executing vanquished Germans and Japanese. Now, we mentioned a few minutes ago Tewkesbury High Street. Assume that in your post tomorrow there's a letter from the police. In fact, it's a summons. They've looked through their ANPR database and they see that one day, nearly 6 years ago, you were driving at 22 miles an hour along the high street. And so they're now charging you with speeding. You plead not guilty. You say to the court, the law, as it then stood, allowed 30 miles an hour. The prosecution then patiently explained to the magistrate that every civilized town in the country has a limit of 20 miles an hour in its centre. They say that the actual law in Tewkesbury is irrelevant. What would you feel if you were convicted and ordered to pay a fine of, say, 100 quid? Banged to rights or outrageously mistreated? If that happened to me, I would feel a deep sense of injustice. I would think, you say you are applying the law, but this is not how the law works. You are distorting the law solely in order to fine me. A speeding offence, of course, is comparatively trivial, but the principle remains. You can't make up a law after the event to convict people of an offence which did not exist at the time of their actions. When the International Military Tribunal convened in Nuremberg, that principle of prohibiting retroactive criminal legislation had existed since Roman times. It had been enshrined in the United States Constitution since 1789, a century and a half previously, at Article 1, Section 10. And in 1950, it was to be introduced into the European Convention on Human Rights at Article 7. And yet, at Nuremberg, on the very eve of the publication of that European Convention, we pretended that in the matter of war criminals of the Second World War, it was entirely irrelevant. That appears to me to be the very antithesis of fairness. I'm not alone in that view. I have on my side somebody who knows, or who knew, far more about the law than I shall ever do, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States at the time, Harlan Stone. He described the Nuremberg trials as a high-class lynching party. But you must form your own view. And lastly, let's turn very briefly to the Far East, to Manila. This is a trial which had many shortcomings, which we won't go into, but it established an important precedent which it is worth noting. General Tomoyuki Yamashita was a brilliant Japanese general, some say Japan's finest. He landed his forces on the Malay Peninsula in early December 1941, and by the 15th of February 1942, he had captured Singapore. In just 9 weeks, he had outfought and outthought his opponent, General Arthur Percival, who had 3 times as many troops under his command. The magnitude of his victory is described by Churchill, albeit from the losing side, as the worst disaster and the largest capitulation in British history. You would have difficulty in not giving Yamashita enormous credit for his accomplishment. 3 years later, he was called upon to defend the Philippines. He was given command of the Japanese 14th Army and arrived in that country on the 9th of October 1944. 10 days later, the Americans landed at Leyte. The Americans had control of the sea and the sky, and they bombed and strafed at will. From the moment the first American boot hit the sand, General Yamashita was in retreat, and he was forced into the hills. Indeed, he was soon able to move only at night, and he lost effective control of his forces. Japan surrendered in August 1945, and the war was over. General Yamashita duly gave himself up. General MacArthur, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, ordered that General Yamashita be put on trial expeditiously. Expeditiously. That is, without wasting a moment, even though the war was now over and they could take as much time as they wanted. The charge against him was that he had permitted his men to commit brutal atrocities. Now, it was obvious that the Japanese troops had committed many horrible war crimes, and there was ample evidence. My own father, who arrived in Hong Kong immediately after the surrender, was well aware of these crimes, and he hated the Japanese, hated them to the depth of his being until his dying day. No one has ever denied that the perpetrators of those crimes should be brought to justice. But General Yamashita said that he knew nothing about war crimes. Indeed, he said that he had given orders that war crimes should not be committed. However, this trial was unique. The prosecution made no effort at all to show that General Yamashita had ordered his troops to commit war crimes, or even that he knew that his troops had committed or were committing such crimes, and that he failed to act to stop them or to punish those guilty. What the prosecution did claim was that General Yamashita either did know, or if he didn't know, that he should have known about these crimes, because they were committed in a number of different areas and over an extended period. And because he knew, or as they claimed, should have known, he was responsible for them because he had taken no or inadequate steps to prevent them. Now, and if that sounds a bit too much like Sir Humphrey, let me put it more simply. The prosecution said that the men were his, and he was therefore responsible for them and everything they did, whether he knew what they were doing or not. And that is called the Yamashita principle. It was that principle, devised on the spot in a hot Manila courtroom, which gave the tribunal the justification to sentence General Yamashita to death. Public reaction to the verdict was highly negative. Mr. Justice Murphy, a judge on America's Supreme Court, said that General Yamashita had been rushed to trial under an improper charge, given insufficient time to prepare an adequate defence, deprived of the benefits of some of the most elementary rules of evidence, and summarily sentenced to be hanged. The American magazine Time described the trial as a damning report on American justice. Newsweek, also an American magazine, said, in the opinion of probably every correspondent covering the trial, the military commission came into the courtroom on the first day with the decision already in its collective pocket. And the Yale Law Review referred simply to a debasement of American law. However, the court had come to its decision, and whether you think that decision was good or bad, wise or foolish, a precedent had been created, and future courts would be bound by it. And a simple question: when was that precedent last used? As far as I'm aware, the answer is at the trial of General Yamashita. So when could it have been used? Well, you might remember the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War, when Lieutenant William Calley shot dead around 500 Vietnamese civilians, including some scores of children under the age of 5. He was, quite correctly in my view, found guilty. But there was also an opportunity to charge his superior officer, Captain Medina, who was standing only a few hundred feet behind him under the Yamashita principle. But the Americans chose not to do so. More recently, in Iraq, soldiers of the Queen's Lancashire Regiment arrested some Iraqi civilians who were totally innocent of any crime, and then, over a period of 40 hours, beat them mercilessly and continuously. One, Baha Musa, died, and another, who was transferred to American custody, required an emergency operation to save his life. If General Yamashita had been guilty for the war crimes committed by his subordinates simply because he should have known about those war crimes, was the commanding officer of the Queen's Lancashire Regiment not also responsible for the death of Baha Musa for precisely the same reason? I think it can fairly be said that the Yamashita principle, so useful in providing a justification for hanging General Yamashita, has died with him. But you must form your own view. To sum up, it has been my intention to set out the salient facts of just 3 trials as well as I could in the time available. And now it is for you to consider whether my arguments have any force. Be clear, I am not saying that there were no war criminals or that all convictions were unsound. All that I am saying is that some convictions were grossly unfair. When I was young, I had a vision of the Allies, dressed in the clothes of avenging angels, swinging the sword of retribution with perfect precision against evildoers. And I saw the German and Japanese generals, men as cruel as their underlings, properly receiving the harsh punishment meted out to so many of them. Those were comforting thoughts. After all, we're British, and being British, we always do the right thing. We always act fairly. We can't do otherwise. It's in our DNA. Now that I know more, I'm less sure. The people of the conquering the people of the conquering nations were angry. Angry because they had suffered for 6 years, angry because their lives had been thrown into turmoil, angry at the injustices they had seen, and they wanted vengeance, or perhaps just revenge. They certainly wanted blood, and the engine of state responded to their demands and gave them what they wanted. If you come into your sitting room and your favourite vase is lying shattered on the floor next to an overturned table, you're likely to blame the 5-year-old standing next to it, not the dog with the long tail in the corner. At Belsen, British soldiers saw healthy German guards standing next to starving prisoners and held them responsible. They beat them up. And the Americans at Dachau did the same, although there they machine-gunned the guards, killing a few score of them. It's an understandable reaction. We associate proximity with responsibility. And besides, the boys were upset. But high passion is the enemy of good judgment. In my view, if some of those guards at Belsen had committed assaults or murder, we should have put them on trial for those crimes, probably under German law, not deploy some fuzzy concept of conspiracy which depended on how the judges felt that day. Did we misuse, distort even, our legal system to vent our anger? Benjamin Ferencz, a young American senior prosecutor at the subsequent Nuremberg trials, understandably desperate to obtain convictions of these evil men, threatened potential witnesses with death if they did not testify, and in fact had 6 killed simply by sending them to a displaced persons camp and announcing that they were SS. In the Far East, no one told Yamashita after his arrest that he was not obliged to say anything, an omission which would, in all probability, have been fatal to the prosecution if he had been accused of some minor crime. And in all these trials, we allowed to be presented as evidence material which the official legal advisor to the Belsen trial, an English KC, warned the court was dangerous. Such material would never have been admitted in a criminal court in England or the United States. In the light of that, can we say that we were always true to our standards of fairness when we dealt with our enemy? I've never understood why all the judges had to be chosen from the conquering nations. They were all tainted, to a greater or lesser extent, by an antipathy towards the defendants whom they had been fighting during 6 years of war. Why was it impossible to have even one judge from a neutral country? Were there no competent Swiss or Swedish or Irish or even German judges who could have brought their independence and impartiality to these trials? Would that not have given the trials a greater chance of being fair and of being seen to be fair? Defendants too have a right to justice, even if their nationality is German or Japanese. But as I've said, we're British, and being British, we always act fairly. Or do we? But now you must form your own view. I can't do it for you. I wish you well. Thank you.